The foundation cracks. The hidden weight behind success. Jacob Carrington stood at the glass wall of his sprawling corner office, the view of his latest state-of-the-art factory gleaming under the afternoon sun. From up here, everything looked perfect. Trucks loading finished products, forklifts darting across the yard like clockwork. His company, Carrington Precision Manufacturing, had become a household name in the industrial world, producing precision parts for automotive, aerospace, and medical companies. What had started 20 years ago in a rented garage was now an empire with 18 factories spread across 14 states. But lately, that empire had developed cracks. Reports were piling up on his desk, not just the typical minor complaints but serious concerns. Declining product quality, soaring employee turnover, anonymous HR reports about abusive supervisors. Every metric that had once made him proud was now becoming a warning sign. He brought his knuckles to his lips, staring out the window. When Jacob had founded this company, it was with the belief that treating people well meant better products. He remembered shaking hands with his first 5 employees, promising to always look out for them, to pay fair wages, to listen when things went wrong. Those promises had built his reputation. Somewhere along the way, that had gotten lost. The polished reports from upper management were full of vague explanations, growing pains, pandemic recovery lag, industry adjustments, but none of them felt like the truth. His gut told him something darker was happening at ground level, and the only way to find out was to go down there himself. The disguise. He had never been a man to sit back when his instincts kicked in. Within a day, Jacob had a plan. He stood in front of the mirror in his penthouse apartment, appraising his reflection. The sharp, tailored suits were gone, replaced by a faded denim shirt, worn jeans, and steel-toed boots. His hair was dyed a dull brown, streaked with gray at the temples, and his usually clean-shaven face was now hidden beneath a scruffy beard. Thick, rectangular glasses completed the disguise. He barely recognized himself. That was the point. Under the name Jack Reynolds, he would join the workforce of Plant Number 6, the factory that had once been his crown jewel but was now the source of most of the anonymous complaints. He wanted to see it, feel it, live it, not as the CEO, but as just another worker. He would walk the floor, shoulder to shoulder with his employees, and find out who was responsible for the cracks in his empire. Stepping into the machine. The moment he stepped through the wide, industrial doors of Plant Number 6, the weight hit him. Not the physical weight of the machinery or the equipment, but the sheer oppression hanging in the air. There was no hum of camaraderie, no laughter, no signs that anyone here enjoyed their job. Only a heavy silence punctuated by the relentless clang of machinery and the barked orders of supervisors. A broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl stood at the entrance, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowed. Name: Jack Reynolds, Jacob replied, keeping his voice low and uncertain. The man, Rick Tolbert, according to his name badge, barely glanced at him before scrawling something on the clipboard. Assembly line. Section D, you keep up or you're out. Jacob nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had managed thousands of employees before, but standing there under Tolbert's sneer, he felt small in a way he hadn't in decades. The factory floor was a living, breathing beast. Conveyor belts rolled at breakneck speed. Machinery hissed and clanked, and workers moved like parts of the machine itself. Their faces blank, their motions mechanical, their postures slumped with exhaustion. It was the complete opposite of the vibrant, collaborative work environment he had imagined when he first opened this plant. Reality bites. Jacob took his place at a worn workstation, his hands trembling slightly as the first components rolled toward him. His task was simple: inspect, sort, and pack. But the pace was brutal. There was no pause, no adjustment period. The line didn't wait for anyone. Sweat beaded on his forehead within minutes. He risked a glance to his left and right. The faces beside him told the story he'd been afraid of seeing. A woman in her 40s, her fingers swollen and raw, moved with mechanical precision, her face blank, eyes dull. A young man barely in his 20s, with dark circles etched beneath his eyes, swayed on his feet, his lips cracked from dehydration. No one talked. No one looked at each other. This wasn't a factory floor. It was a battlefield. The collapse. The young man to Jacob's right, his name tag read Miguel, suddenly faltered, his hands trembling so badly that parts began to slip from his grasp. Jacob's heart pounded as he saw the boy wobble, then collapse like a marionette with cut strings, his body hitting the concrete with a sickening thud. For a second, no one moved. The line didn't stop. Rick's voice cut through the air like a whip. Somebody drag him out of the way. Jacob's stomach turned. We should call for help. Shut it, new guy. Rick growled. He's fine. Happens all the time. Happens all the time. Jacob's fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. This was his factory, and this was how his people were being treated. They were disposable. The human cost. A woman named Karina, stationed across from Jacob, knelt beside Miguel, her face tight with worry. She gently patted his cheeks until his eyes fluttered open. His skin was pale, his breath ragged. You need water, Jacob said, his voice trembling. No time, Rick barked. Get back to work. Karina, however, ignored him and sprinted to the break room, returning with a battered water bottle. Miguel sipped weakly, his hands shaking too much to hold it himself. The shift went on. Jacob watched as Miguel forced himself to stand, legs trembling, face gray with exhaustion. Yet he said nothing. No complaints, no asking to leave. The quiet resignation in his eyes was like a slap to Jacob's soul. What had happened to his dream? The numbers lie. During a rare bathroom break, Jacob passed an unlocked office door, where a clipboard of weekly quotas and performance metrics lay unattended. He skimmed it quickly, his heart sinking. Quota targets were absurdly high. Break times were shaved down to the bare legal minimum. Overtime requests were denied unless production fell behind. And then workers were coerced into staying late, unpaid. Everything was about the numbers. Speed over quality. Output over safety. Metrics over people. He knew, in that instant, that the reports upper management had fed him were lies. These workers weren't lazy, unskilled, or unmotivated. They were exhausted, overworked, underpaid, and ignored. And it had happened under his watch. Seeds of change. The old Jacob might have confronted Rick then and there, fired him on the spot. But this wasn't about one bad supervisor. It was about a culture that had festered unchecked for years. A culture Jacob himself had unintentionally nurtured by trusting the wrong people and prioritizing growth over human dignity. He needed proof. He needed to understand how deep the rot went. So he stayed. He worked the line. He listened to the whispers, the complaints too soft for supervisors to hear, the quiet admissions that things had once been better, back when the old man cared. The old man still cared. They just didn't know he was standing beside them. Shadows in the machine. The weight of silence. The factory floor felt heavier the next morning, though Jacob couldn't say why. Maybe it was the weight of what he now knew, or maybe it was the way his fellow workers shuffled in with the same dead-eyed expressions they had worn the day before, as if their souls had been packed away with the outgoing shipments. He stood by his station in Section D, just another nameless cog in the machine, and tried to slip back into his role as Jack Reynolds. But his mind was racing. He wasn't just here to do the work. He was here to witness, to feel. The conveyor belt lurched to life, and the parts started rolling in. The pace was no slower than the day before. If anything, it was faster. New quotas had been posted on a clipboard near the supervisor's desk. They were absurd. Jacob's hands moved mechanically, inspecting parts, packing them into boxes, his muscles already sore from the relentless repetition of the previous day. He wasn't young anymore. His back protested, his wrists ached, and his shoulders burned. Yet he wasn't even close to the level of exhaustion written on the faces around him. This was their life. Day in, day out. The invisible chains. Jacob found himself watching Karina, the woman who had helped Miguel when he collapsed. She was fast, almost too fast, her hands moving with the kind of automatic precision that only came from sheer survival. Every part she touched was inspected in seconds and sent down the line. No wasted movements, no pauses, only speed. She was the kind of worker supervisors like Rick prized, not because she was valued, but because she was too afraid to stop. Every so often, her eyes flicked to the security camera mounted above the line. A tiny red light blinked lazily, its glass lens pointed directly at the worker's hands. Monitoring productivity, Jacob realized. Every slowdown, every second spent wiping sweat from their brows, was recorded and analyzed. There were no chains, no whips, no barking overseers. But the fear was there, invisible and suffocating. Jack. The voice startled him. He turned to see Logan, the young man who had collapsed the day before, back at his station. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but he was here, moving slower, but still moving. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted parts onto the belt. "Are you okay?" Jacob asked quietly, careful not to draw Rick's attention. Logan managed a weak smile. "I'm fine." He wasn't. They both knew it. The fear of stopping. "Why did you come back?" Jacob pressed. "You could have taken a day off." Logan's smile faded. "I can't afford to. They cut hours if you miss too much, and if you get labeled unreliable." His voice trailed off, but Jacob understood. If you weren't reliable, you became replaceable. That word sat heavy in Jacob's chest. Replaceable. After everything these people gave, their sweat, their health, their time, they were disposable parts in the corporate machine. And it was his machine. Breaking the silence. The morning passed in a blur of aching muscles and assembly line monotony. During the first break, Jacob followed the others to the break room, if it could even be called that. The room was stifling, the air thick with the smell of microwave meals and industrial grease. There were exactly 6 plastic chairs for over 30 workers. Most of them sat on the floor, their backs against the walls, eating in silence. A vending machine stood in the corner, half empty, with prices that made Jacob's stomach turn, charging workers double for snacks they could buy at a gas station down the street. The water dispenser was nearly dry, a weak trickle dribbling from the spout. Workers cupped their hands under it, sipping enough to wet their mouths before retreating to their corners. This was their sanctuary, and it was a prison. Jacob sank down beside Logan, who was nibbling at a protein bar like it was the only food he'd see all day. "I don't understand," Jacob said softly. "Why don't you all say something? File complaints." Logan gave him a look that was equal parts pity and exhaustion. "We do. Some of us. But it doesn't go anywhere. The supervisors read the complaints, and if you make too much noise, your hours get cut, your shifts get harder, and eventually you just disappear. Disappear." Logan broke off a piece of the bar, handing it to Jacob without thinking. A small act of kindness in a place that seemed to punish kindness. People quit, or they're fired for performance issues. Either way, they're gone, and no one asks questions. Jacob took the protein bar but couldn't bring himself to eat it. It tasted like guilt. The rot runs deep. Later that afternoon, Jacob noticed something strange. A pile of defective parts sat at the far end of the line, stacked higher than the day before. Workers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering under their breath. The quality control worker, a wiry man named Eddie, stood with his arms crossed, glaring at the parts like they had personally insulted him. "Problem?" Jacob asked quietly, stepping beside him. Eddie snorted. "You could say that. These parts are all off-spec. Dimensions are wrong. Finish is off. But Rick says to ship them anyway." Jacob's stomach churned. "They're not going to the customer like this, are they?" "Every damn day," Eddie muttered. "I flagged it in the system. I've told Rick. I even called the corporate quality line once. And nothing, Eddie said bitterly. Got a warning for slowing down production. So now I just pile them up and hope someone gives a Dan. Jacob gave a Dan. But saying so now wouldn't fix anything. The unspoken rules. By the time the shift ended, Jacob's body ached in ways he hadn't felt since his 20s. But it wasn't the physical pain that kept him awake that night. It was the unspoken rules that governed the factory. Don't speak up. Don't slow down. Don't ask questions. Don't expect fairness. These weren't just policies. They were survival instincts, passed down from veteran workers to new hires, a secret code whispered over lunch breaks and muttered during stolen moments in the bathroom. They were the real operating manual of Plant Number 6, the crumbling illusion. Jacob lay awake in the tiny motel room he had rented near the factory, staring at the cracked ceiling. All the reports he had been shown in his corporate office, the graphs, the charts, the spreadsheets, they were a mirage. None of them reflected the reality on the floor. This wasn't a factory. It was a pressure cooker. And it wasn't broken because of external forces, market conditions, supply chain issues, or economic downturns. It was broken because he had trusted the wrong people to run it. People like Rick, who saw humans as tools to be used up and discarded. His vision, the dream of building a company where people were respected and quality mattered, was rotting from the inside out. And the rot wore his company's name, a silent vow. Jacob closed his eyes, hands clenched into fists. He hadn't come here just to witness. He had come to understand. Now he understood. Now he was angry. But anger wasn't enough. He needed to know how deep the infection ran, not just here, but across every factory bearing his name. And once he knew, he would cut it out, root and stem. But first, he would listen. To the whispers. To the stories no one dared to say out loud. To the workers who had waited far too long for someone to actually care. Tomorrow, Jack Reynolds would return to the factory floor. And soon, Jacob Carrington would return to take back his company. The weight of every hour, when paychecks come at a cost. The next morning, Jacob arrived at Plant Number 6 before the sun had fully risen. The sky, a slate gray, stretched across the industrial skyline. The factory's fluorescent lights flickered faintly through the misted windows, a pale reflection of the energy already being spent inside. The workers stood in loose groups outside the side entrance, clutching cheap thermoses of coffee or cans of energy drinks, their conversations low and muted. These weren't people preparing to work. They were soldiers bracing themselves for another day at war. Jacob, still cloaked in his identity as Jack Reynolds, stood among them, hands tucked in the pockets of his worn jacket, blending into the background. No one questioned his presence. No one asked his story. In this place, everyone knew better than to care too much about the new guy. That was the first thing Jacob had come to understand. Caring was dangerous here. The cost of showing weakness. The first time Jacob had stepped onto the factory floor as CEO, more than a decade earlier, he had shaken hands with every worker, eager to hear their stories. They had talked then about their families, their hobbies, their lives outside the factory walls. That openness was gone now. Here, silence was armor. If you talked too much, someone would listen. If you asked too many questions, someone would notice. And if you slowed down, even for a second, the machine would eat you alive. As they filed in, Jacob caught sight of Karina, her long dark hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. She walked with the kind of stiff, aching gait that told him this wasn't her first day, or her first year, on the line. But it was the way her eyes darted, constantly tracking the room, that really struck him. She wasn't just working. She was surviving. He fell into step beside her. "Morning," he said softly. She gave him the briefest glance. Morning. That was it. No small talk. No banter. Just two people who knew they had 12 hours of grinding, unforgiving work ahead of them. the human price of a product. The line started the moment the shift clock hit 6 a.m. There was no ramp-up period, no easing into the day. The machines roared to life, conveyor belts rattling under the weight of raw materials, and hands, hundreds of them, dove into motion. Jacob worked alongside them, muscles already aching from the previous 2 days. His hands were slower than the veterans around him, his reflexes dulled by decades in an office instead of on a line. By the second hour, the burn settled deep into his shoulders and lower back, a steady ache that would normally send him to a chiropractor. The others felt it too, but they didn't flinch. They didn't pause. Jacob watched as Logan, still pale and slightly unsteady, gritted his teeth and pushed through each part, eyes glazed over. Miguel, who had collapsed 2 days earlier, was back. His face gaunt, his movements slow, but his fear of falling behind sharper than his pain. That was the trade-off here. You could hurt, you could break, but you could never stop. The truth hidden in the break room. The only time Jacob saw even a hint of humanity was during the 10-minute morning break. The moment the line halted, workers collapsed into the break room. Every seat filled within seconds, with the rest sitting cross-legged on the floor or leaning against the walls. It was a room too small for the crew it served, with air so stale it felt like breathing through a pillow. Jacob took a seat on the floor beside Maria, one of the quieter veterans. She was a wiry woman in her 50s with permanent grease under her fingernails and the kind of face that had weathered too many storms. "Do you ever get used to it?" Jacob asked softly. Maria gave a dry, humorless laugh. "What? The pain or the silence?" "Both." She wiped her forehead with the edge of her sleeve. "You learn not to think about it. If you think about it too much, you start wondering why you're here at all." Jacob leaned against the wall, watching as a few younger workers scarfed down stale granola bars and vending machine snacks. Every moment of the break counted like gold. None of them were smiling. No one laughed. Even the sound of chewing felt too loud, as if they were afraid someone might think they were enjoying themselves. "Why do you stay?" he asked. Maria's expression softened. The question was too personal, but she answered anyway. "My son's in college. Scholarships don't cover everything. And you?" She glanced around, making sure no supervisors were within earshot. "I'm 56. I've got bad knees, a bad back, and I didn't finish high school. Where else am I gonna go?" Jacob didn't have an answer. Not yet. The cruelty of the clock. When the break ended, the line roared back to life, swallowing every worker whole. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he took his position, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of what he was seeing. These people weren't lazy. They weren't unskilled. They were fighters, pushing through pain, fear, and exhaustion because they had no other choice. And the system, his system, didn't just ignore them. It punished them for needing to breathe. The unspoken sacrifices. Around noon, Jacob spotted Logan slipping out of the bathroom, his face pale, eyes rimmed with red. He'd seen that look before, not illness, but someone on the edge of collapse, held together by nothing but fear. "You okay?" Jacob asked quietly as Logan stepped back onto the line. "Yeah," Logan mumbled. "Just tired." But Jacob saw the way Logan's hands shook. He saw the way Logan's eyes darted to the clock every few minutes, counting down the endless hours ahead. These workers didn't live their days. They survived them. And every minute, every second, was counted not in wages, but in pieces of themselves they gave away. The rot in the roots. At the end of the shift, Jacob stood at the time clock, watching workers punch out. Some limped, others hunched over like old men and women decades before their time. Their paychecks would barely cover rent, let alone the medications they were bound to need after years on this line. He had built this company on the belief that people mattered, but these people didn't feel like they mattered at all. And somewhere along the way, between rapid expansions, market pressures, and the endless pursuit of efficiency, Jacob had let that belief die. It hadn't been deliberate. He had trusted managers to keep his vision alive. He had believed the reports, the polished presentations, the friendly emails assuring him that all was well. But those reports had never mentioned Miguel's collapse. They had never listed Logan's shaking hands. They had never counted the bones these workers broke to keep his factories running. The first spark. As the workers filtered out, Jacob stayed behind, watching the silent exodus of tired bodies disappearing into the night. Every pair of hands that had built his empire walked past him, and none of them knew who he really was. But soon they would. The change couldn't come from behind a desk or in a corporate memo. It had to start here, on this floor, with these people. As the last worker left, Jacob turned to face the darkened factory. It wasn't just metal and machines. It was the weight of every hour these people had given. And if Jacob was going to save his company and his soul, he'd have to carry that weight with them. Voices in the dust. Every scar tells a story. The sound of the factory faded into the early morning air as Jacob arrived at plant number 6 for the 4th day of his undercover shift. The whine of machinery and the rhythmic clatter of conveyor belts hadn't changed, but something in Jacob had. The weight of everything he had seen. Miguel's collapse, Logan's trembling hands, Maria's resigned silence, sat in his chest like a stone. He had founded this company with the belief that work should mean more than survival. But these people weren't living. They were grinding themselves down to dust. The worst part, it was his name on the wall. Morning rituals of the forgotten. Before the official shift started, Jacob lingered outside, blending into the cluster of workers huddled near the loading dock. They didn't talk much. Small talk was a luxury they couldn't afford. But the air was heavy with shared exhaustion. A few stood with their hands curled around steaming cups of coffee, not sipping it so much as holding on to the warmth like a lifeline. Jacob caught snatches of conversation. Complaints about the latest rent hike, about a kid's braces, about a brother who'd been fired from another factory for speaking up about overtime pay disappearing from his check. He wasn't surprised anymore, but he was still angry. Karina stood a few feet away, eyes flicking to the factory doors every minute or two, like a prisoner waiting for the warden to unlock the gates. They all watched the doors that way, not with anticipation, but dread, knowing that on the other side was 12 hours of losing themselves piece by piece. "You should take a day off," Jacob said quietly, stepping closer. Karina turned, her brow furrowed. "You're new here. You don't understand how it works." "Help me understand." She looked away, as if debating whether to speak. Finally, she sighed. "If you miss a day, your hours get cut for the rest of the week. 2 days. You're lucky if they put you on the schedule at all. Sick time doesn't exist unless you've been here 10 years. And even then, good luck getting it approved. But that's not in the policy." Jacob's stomach twisted even as he said it, because he had written the original policy himself. Karina's laugh was low and bitter. "Policy? Policy's just a piece of paper no one's seen in years." Jacob felt that like a gut punch, the human cost of quiet betrayals. The shift started, and the factory's heartbeat returned. The relentless thump of machinery, the hiss of hydraulics, the snap of plastic being packed into boxes. Jacob's muscles screamed in protest after only 3 days, but his coworkers, some who'd been doing this for years, didn't flinch. That was what haunted him most. The numbness. Logan was back at his station, pale but present, the bruises under his eyes darker than before. Every few minutes, Jacob caught him swaying slightly, but the kid never stopped. Miguel was slower today, his hands stiff, and Jacob could see the thin white bandage peeking out from under his sleeve. A fresh cut, probably from pushing through exhaustion. And no one asked about it. This was normal here. Lunch break confessions. During the lunch break, a brutal 16-minute countdown. Jacob didn't sit alone. He joined Maria, Logan, and Miguel, crammed into a corner where the vending machine whirred faintly beside them. The break room was too small for humanity, but they carved out a fragile corner for it anyway. "What did you do before this?" Jacob asked, peeling open a vending machine sandwich that tasted faintly of cardboard and regret. Maria raised an eyebrow. "Before this place, I worked at a bakery." "A bakery?" She smiled, faintly. "Yeah, long time ago. I loved it. Kneading dough, shaping bread. It felt like making something people actually wanted." "What happened?" She shrugged. "They shut down when a bigger chain moved in. This place was hiring. Pays the bills." Logan was chewing slowly, like every bite was a task. "I was gonna go to school for auto repair. Then my dad got hurt. And, well," he gestured around them, "here I am. And you, Miguel." The young man gave a shy smile. "I was saving up to open a little shop, maybe a taco truck, but I keep having to dip into my savings every time my mom's medicine runs out." The stories felt like stones being stacked on Jacob's back, each one heavier than the last. These weren't just workers. They were people who'd traded their dreams for survival, and the machine had swallowed those dreams whole. A factory built on fear. That afternoon, Jacob caught Rick, the shift supervisor, berating an older worker named Vince, a man easily in his 60s, for moving too slowly. Vince's hands shook slightly, arthritis visibly gnawing at his knuckles. "You want to work here, you pick up the pace." Rick's voice carried over the din of the factory. "Otherwise, there's the door." Jacob's fists curled at his sides. But Jack Reynolds, the temp worker, couldn't speak up. Not yet. He needed to understand just how far this rot went. After Rick stomped off, Jacob stepped closer to Vince. "You okay?" Vince smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had learned not to expect kindness. "It's just my hands. They don't work as fast as they used to." "How long you been here?" 17 years. Vince's eyes softened, pride flickering there despite everything. "I was here when we made the first run, back when your CEO actually came down to the floor and shook hands with us." Jacob's throat tightened. "He used to do that." "Yeah," Vince said, "but that was a long time ago." The unseen tolls. That night, Jacob sat alone in his motel room, hands aching, back screaming, his heart heavier than ever. He had built this company. He had poured his soul into it. But somewhere along the way, it had become a beast, feeding on the very people who had built it with him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the policies he had once drafted himself. Paid sick leave. Safety audits every quarter. Fair overtime compensation. Open door reporting policies. On paper, they were perfect. But in reality, they were lies. The supervisors had twisted every policy into a weapon, turning protections into punishments, twisting incentives into fear, and no one at corporate, including Jacob himself, had ever seen it happening. He had let the rot spread because he had believed the numbers, the reports, the assurances from middle management that all was well. All was not well. A silent promise. Jacob lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, a new vow forming inside him. He wasn't going to save this factory from behind a desk. He was going to stand beside these people until the air changed, until they could breathe, until they could laugh, until they believed they mattered again. And then, when the time was right, he would burn the rot out of every corner of his empire, starting with Rick and every other manager who had treated these workers like disposable parts. Tomorrow, Jack Reynolds would clock in again. But soon, Jacob Carrington would rise. And when he did, the machine would have to answer for every scar it had left. Cracks in the walls. When silence screams for justice. The fifth morning at plant number 6 dawned like the others. Cold and gray, the kind of day where the sun seemed reluctant to rise over a place that swallowed so much light. Jacob stood at the edge of the employee parking lot, the steady hum of approaching cars blending with the distant rumble of early trucks. The factory loomed ahead of him, a beast made of steel and silence, and inside it, the people who kept it alive. People who had long since learned that the only way to survive was to stay quiet, stay small, and stay invisible. But not today. Not for Jacob. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was feeling it all. The weight, the frustration, the hopelessness, pressing down on his shoulders like a second skin. And it was time to start pushing back. Small acts of defiance. Jacob clocked in as Jack Reynolds, but in his mind, the mask was already starting to slip. Each passing day made it harder to pretend. The longer he stood beside his workers, his people, the more their stories settled into his bones. Today, it wasn't enough to observe. He needed to test the system. At his station on Line 3, Jacob worked at the usual breakneck speed. But this time, when his fingers cramped, he stopped. Just for 5 seconds, long enough to shake out his hand, flex his wrist. It was nothing, barely noticeable. But Rick noticed. "You slowing down already, old man?" Rick's voice cut across the din, loud enough for half the line to hear. "If your hands don't work, maybe you're in the wrong place." Jacob held his tongue. The old him, the CEO with power, raging beneath his skin. But Jack Reynolds just nodded and went back to work, wrists aching, heart pounding. 5 seconds, and already the system moved to crush him. What did that mean for workers who had no power at all? Whispers in the corners. Break time came, and Jacob made a point of walking slower than usual to the break room, letting his eyes wander. He saw what management would never list in their polished reports. Workers leaning against walls with their eyes closed, clutching their lower backs, stretching out their arms to ease the permanent ache. In a far corner near the emergency exit, Logan and Miguel huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Jacob made his way over, casual, but listening. "Said he's gonna cut the next shift down by 4 hours, Miguel was saying, his face tight with frustration. "Which 4? Logan asked. Miguel shook his head. "Don't know. Probably the ones who talked to HR last week." Jacob's stomach dropped. They had tried. They had filed complaints. And the system had retaliated. It was the exact opposite of everything Jacob had believed his company stood for. He sat down beside them without a word, unwrapping a vending machine sandwich he didn't plan to eat. Logan gave him a nod. "How's the new guy holding up?" Jacob managed a smile. "My hands hate me, but I'm still here." Miguel's laugh was soft, barely more than a breath. "They always say you get used to it. You don't. You just stop noticing how much it hurts." The words hit Jacob harder than any punch. The workers here didn't adjust. They just numbed themselves. The price of fear. As the shift dragged on, Jacob began to see the other side of fear, the small, human rebellions that flickered beneath the surface. Maria, always moving fast enough to stay off Rick's radar, kept a quiet eye on Miguel, shifting closer every time she saw him wobble. She couldn't protect him. Not really, but even a small presence seemed to matter. Eddie, the quality control worker at the end of the line, still pulled defective parts despite knowing they'd be shipped anyway. His pile grew steadily larger, a quiet testament to his refusal to compromise, even if it cost him. Vince, the older worker Jacob had spoken to the day before, had wrapped a makeshift brace around his knee, probably torn from a piece of packing foam, just to get through the day. None of these were official protests. No one waved signs or demanded better conditions, but they were protests all the same. The smallest possible acts of resistance in a place where resistance got you punished. Jacob had built his company to reward effort. Instead, it punished the very people who cared enough to try. The incident at Station 12. It happened right after lunch, a sharp metallic shriek from the far end of the floor. Jacob's head snapped up in time to see a worker named Carla stumble back from her station, her gloved hand pressed to her forearm. Blood seeped through the fabric. Rick was already moving. What the hell happened? Carla stammered, her face pale. The guardrail. It slipped and Rick didn't let her finish. Get to the nurse if you need to. But don't expect any overtime if you leave early. Jacob took a step forward, every instinct screaming at him. This wasn't policy. This was extortion. He followed Carla as she walked toward the small first aid room, a converted storage closet with a worn cot and a half-stocked medical cabinet. The company's safety policy, the one Jacob had signed off on, required fully trained medical staff on site during every shift. Instead, the floor supervisor doubled as the nurse, a man whose only qualification seemed to be knowing how to take gauze. Jacob couldn't stand it anymore. "Shouldn't someone check that machine before anyone else uses it?" he asked. Rick's head snapped around. "You questioning me, Jack?" "Just saying, it's not safe." Rick's eyes narrowed. "You worry about your own station." Jacob's hands clenched at his sides. "Not yet. Not yet. The stories they don't tell HR." That night, after the shift ended, Jacob joined Logan, Miguel, Maria, and a handful of others in the parking lot. They lingered by the fence, too tired to leave, too drained to talk much. But after a while, the stories started coming. Miguel's mother had worked in plant number 6 before him, until she slipped on an oil spill that no one ever cleaned. She'd broken her hip, and after her medical leave ran out, her job mysteriously disappeared. Maria's sister had been fired for taking an unscheduled break, the break she took after passing out from heat exhaustion during a double shift. Logan's best friend had been written up for refusing overtime on the same day his father had a heart attack. He had to choose, his job or his family. Jacob listened, every story another nail through his pride. This was his factory. These were his people, and he had abandoned them without ever knowing it. The fracture point. Lying in his cheap motel bed that night, Jacob could feel the fracture forming inside him. Part of him, the CEO, the polished man in tailored suits, had trusted his managers. He had believed the charts, the data, the reports. But the other part, the man who had built this company from nothing, was angrier than he had ever been. The betrayal was personal, not just of him, but of everything he had wanted his company to stand for. Tomorrow, something would have to change. Not in memos or policies, but face to face. He could feel the mask of Jack Reynolds cracking. The time for watching was over. The time for acting had come. The mask comes off. When the walls crack open, the 6th day at plant number 6 began like every other, except for the storm inside Jacob Carrington's chest. The battered factory doors opened to swallow him up, just as they did to the dozens of workers filing in beside him. But today, Jack Reynolds was already half gone. Beneath the faded jeans, behind the fake glasses and scruffy beard, the CEO was awake, and the man who had built this empire from nothing was done being a ghost. Today, they would see him. All of him. But first, Jacob needed one more thing. Proof. The final confirmation. The line started moving at 6:00 a.m. sharp, the machinery's grinding roar louder than usual, or maybe that was just the pounding in Jacob's ears. Every motion, picking, sorting, packing, was the same as before, but today, Jacob's senses were razor sharp. He wasn't just working anymore. He was hunting. Rick was on the prowl early, barking at a worker named Nate whose hands were shaking too much to keep up with the quota. Nate looked about 19, too young to already look so defeated. "Move faster, or I'll find someone who can," Rick snapped. Nate didn't argue. None of them ever did. Jacob's jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. Not anymore. At the next break, Jacob lingered in the hallway near the break room, where a supervisor's desk stood just out of sight from the security cameras. A clipboard lay unattended, the weekly payroll adjustment log. He skimmed the names and saw exactly what he expected. Miguel, hours cut last week after collapsing. Karina, 1 unpaid hour docked for extended bathroom break. Logan, listed for mandatory overtime, no record of him accepting. They had been telling the truth all along. The system wasn't just broken, it was rigged. Jacob took a photo with the burner phone he had bought on his first day as Jack Reynolds. Proof. Real, undeniable proof. It was time. Breaking the silence. The moment came faster than Jacob expected. Back on the floor, Logan's hand slipped. A small metal bracket clattered to the ground, the sound sharp enough to pierce the grinding noise of the conveyor belts. Every head turned, and so did Rick's. "What the hell's wrong with you?" Rick's voice was louder than usual, maybe because of the growing frustration in the room. "You screw up my line again, and you can clock out for good." Logan opened his mouth to apologize, but Jacob was already stepping forward. "That's enough." The words cut through the air like a crack of thunder. Every eye swung toward him. Workers froze. Machines didn't. The line kept moving, but Jacob didn't care. "Excuse me." Rick's sneer was automatic. "I said that's enough." Jacob's voice was calm, but it carried weight. For the first time all week, he stood straight, shoulders back, no trace of the timid temp worker left. "What do you think you're doing, Jack?" Rick stalked toward him, the arrogance dripping from every step. "This isn't a democracy." "No," Jacob agreed, "but it is my factory." He reached up and pulled off the fake glasses. With one hand, he tugged off the scratchy beard, revealing the face every executive, every manager, and every PR photo had shown for 2 decades. Jacob Carrington, founder and CEO. The silence was absolute. Rick's face went pale. His mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The workers, Maria, Miguel, Logan, Karina, stared in stunned disbelief. "Yeah," Jacob said softly. "I'm not Jack. I'm Jacob Carrington. And I've seen enough." Tearing down the lie. Jacob turned in a slow circle, addressing the workers, not the managers. "I came here undercover because I didn't trust the reports I was getting. What I've seen this week, the way you're treated, the way you're punished for being human. It's not the company I built. It's not the company I promised." No one spoke, but the disbelief in their eyes was heartbreaking. "I saw Miguel collapse, and no one cared. I saw Logan work himself into the ground because he's terrified of losing hours. I saw Maria do the job of a supervisor without the title or the pay. I saw all of you, working like your lives depended on it, because they do." He took a breath, the weight of his own guilt pressing down. "I didn't see that from my office. I didn't know, and that's on me." He turned back to Rick, whose confidence had dissolved into a sweaty, nervous shell. "But you knew," Jacob said, voice low and sharp. "You knew, and you let it happen. You encouraged it." "Sir, I was." "Don't." Jacob's voice cut through Rick's excuse like a blade. "I've seen enough." He turned to the assembled workers. "How many of you have been pressured to skip breaks?" Hands went up, dozens of them. "How many of you were told your hours would be cut if you spoke up?" More hands. "How many of you have been injured on this floor and were told to walk it off?" The silence was heavy, but hands still rose into the air. Jacob's fists curled at his sides. "This ends today." Firing the rot. "Rick," Jacob said, "you're done. Hand in your badge." Rick stammered. "You can't. I was following." "No," Jacob cut him off. "You were following your own rules, not mine. You created a culture of fear, and you let this place rot from the inside out. Get out." Security, summoned by a quick call to HR earlier, was already stepping onto the floor. Rick's protests were loud but meaningless as they escorted him off the floor. The workers said nothing. No cheers. No relief. They had seen managers come and go. They had heard promises before. Jacob knew words wouldn't fix this. The promise. He stepped back onto a crate, looking at the faces before him. Tired, skeptical, hopeful in only the faintest sense. "This isn't over," Jacob said. I'm not walking out that door and leaving you behind. Starting today, every policy, every supervisor, every rule that treats you like you don't matter, it's gone." He held up his phone, showing the photos of the manipulated payroll logs, the reports Rick thought no one would see. "I have proof. I'm not just cleaning up this factory. I'm cleaning up all of them. You deserve better." Maria's voice, quiet but firm, broke the silence. "We've heard that before." "I know." Jacob met her gaze. "That's why I'm staying. For the next month, I'm working this floor. As me, not as Jack. I want you to show me everything, tell me everything. And if you see me slipping into some comfortable office excuse, I want you to remind me of what I saw here." For the first time, there was a flicker of something other than doubt in Maria's eyes. "You'll listen?" she asked. Jacob nodded. "I will." The first step forward. By the end of the shift, the tension had started to ease. Workers moved slower, less afraid of invisible eyes tracking their every second. Jacob stood with Logan and Miguel at the time clock. "You're serious?" Logan asked. "You're staying?" "I am," Jacob said. "And when I'm done here, I'm going to every other factory. I built this place to be better than this." Miguel's smile was small, but real. "We'll hold you to it. You better." As the workers filtered out into the night, Jacob stood by the door, shaking hands with every single one. It was what he had done when the factory first opened. And now it was how he would start over. Because companies don't rise on profits alone. They rise on people. And Jacob was finally ready to remember that.